We continue now at the top of Daf Kufyud Beizam and Beizam Mesechet Sanhedrin. This is Sanhedrin Daf 112b. The Mishnah said, "V'ha'ikdeshos shebo." If there's consecrated items inside the Ir Hanidachas, so yiftu, so they have to be redeemed, etc. And the Gemara says, "Tanu Rabbanan," the rabbis taught, "Hayu ba kachim." If you have consecrated items in the Ir Hanidachas, so it depends. Kachim mizbeach. If it's consecrated to the mizbeach, meaning it's animals that are supposed to be brought to the mizbeach, they're supposed to be brought as karbonos. So yamusu, so they have to die. Kachim bedek habayis. If it's kachim that's bedek habayis, that means what's donated to the Beis Hamikdash for the purposes of the repair of the Beis Hamikdash. So yiftu, that should be redeemed. Utrumos yirkavu, and truma, that should be left to rot. Meiser Sheni v'chisvei hakodesh, and Meiser Sheni and the holy writings yignazu, those should be buried. And Rashi explains, Hayu ba kachim mizbeach. If there are kachim mizbeach, kagon olos v'ashamos. Let's say you have carbon ola or carbon asham, shel rishayim. It belongs to wicked people. Besoch, and it's within the city of the Ir Hanidachas. Nihidalo karinan buas kol behemta leficharev. Now, granted, we don't apply that you kill those animals by the sword to halo behemtahi, because it's not really the animals that belong to the residents. Ela behem es shamayim. That's considered an animal that belongs to heaven. But ela mi'isusahu. But it is considered disgusting. Lahakrev karbonos shel rishayim halalu, to bring karbonos of these wicked people shehudchu, who were subverted, who worshipped avodah zarah. Hilkach, therefore yamusu. Therefore these animals, they have to die. That's kachem mizbeach yamusu. Konsin oso lekipa, we gather them into a pen. Umachilan oson saorin, we feed them barley at shakres and nifkas, until their stomachs swell. Da'afilu demeyem aser kedal kamon, even their value is aser, as we will say later on. And the Brisa continues, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Behemta, when the Pasuk says the animals of the residents of the Ir Hanidachas, it comes to exclude Velo Behemes Bechor Umaiser, that comes to exclude an animal that's a firstborn, or an animal that's Maiser Behema. And Shlola, when it says it spoils, Prat Lekesef Hektish Vekesef Maiser, that comes to exclude money of Hektish and money of Maiser. And Rashi explains, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, L'kamon Meforesh Taima, later on the Gemara will explain the reasoning of Rabbi Shimon. And the Gemara continues, Amar Mar, the master said, we just said in the above Bryce, so Hayu ba kachim, if there are kachim in the city, kachim mizbeach yamusu, if it's animals that are meant to go on the mizbeach, they should die. And the Gemara asks, V'amay yamusu, now why is it that these animals should die? Yiruat sheyistoavu, why don't we say that we should let them graze until they develop a blemish, and then v'yimachru, then they can be sold, v'yiplu d'mein l'nadav, and then the money can fall as a donation to the Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara says, Rabbi Yochanan says, the reason why we don't do this is because Zevach Rishayim Toeva, because the sacrifice of the wicked is considered an abomination. And Reish Lakish says a different answer. Mamun Bailamu, this is considered still the money of its owners. V'hacha b'kachim shechai b'achar yusan. Here we're talking specifically about kachim, about karbonos, that the owner is responsible. If something should happen to the animal, he needs to bring another animal instead. V'Rebbi Shimon, he diyamar, and according to this approach of Reish Lakish, this part of the Brisa would follow Rabbi Shimon, diyamar, who says Mamun Bailam, who says again, when you have kachim shechai b'achar yusan, that is Mamun Bailam. And Rashi explains Zevach Rishayim Toeva, the approach of Rabbi Yochanan is Zevach Rishayim Toeva. That's why you can't wait till it develops a mum and then sell it and the money will be donated. Meaning Va'afilu Demein Asur, because of this pasuk, even the money is prohibited. That's why that's not a good solution. For Rabbi Shimon who Da'amar, and then Reish Lakish's answer is it's Mamun Bailam, and this follows Rabbi Shimon who says B'Hazav, who says in Hazav in Bab Mitzia that Kodshim Shechai B'Achar Yusan, if you have karbonos, which the owner is responsible for, he has to bring another animal if something happens to that animal, that's considered Mamun Bailam. It's considered money of the owner. It's considered not that it belongs to Shamayim, but it belongs to the owner. V'yesh b'hem ona, the laws of ona would apply. And Hilkach, therefore, in terms of our situation, l'inyan Ir Hanidachas, in terms of Ir Hanidachas, nami mamun bailamu. Also, it's considered to be mamun bailam. V'daininu leficharev kashar behemos shebesocha. The point is, it's therefore considered like any other property in the Ir Hanidachas that does need to be destroyed. V'hilkach asur and demein b'hana. That's why their value is also going to be asur b'hana, because it has to be destroyed. And so then the point is, that's why it has to die. But v'hai t'kamar yamusu. Now, the reason why the Brisa uses the term yamusu, why say kachem mizbeach yamusu? V'lo amar sheyachrimo so imam. Just simply say it's destroyed together with everything else that's in the city. Essentially, according to Reish Lakish's approach, these animals are considered like any other animals in the city. So why are you specifically saying yamusu as if this is some separate halacha? That's just mishum kavod shamayim. That's because the honor of heaven, we don't want to state as if we're treating it exactly like all of the other animals. And so instead we use the term yamusu. That's Reish Lakish's approach. But the Gemara continues and questions Reish Lakish, Hamid the Sefer Rabbi Shimon. If the Sefer of the Brisa, the end of the Brisa, we have an opinion of Rabbi Shimon. That's Rabbi Shimon Omer Behemta Velo Behemes Bechor Umaiser, etc. So if that end of the Brisa is Rabbi Shimon, so Reisha Lav Rabbi Shimon, doesn't that imply that the first part of the Brisa, the Tanakama, is not Rabbi Shimon? So how can Reish Lakish explain the first part of the Brisa, which says Kachem Mizbeach Yamusu? He explains that according to Rabbi Shimon. That doesn't make any sense. And so the Gemara continues and says, Bekachem Kalim. Actually, what we're talking about is Kachem Kalim. The Aliva de Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, and that first part of the Bryce, it's not following Rabbi Shimon, it's actually following Rabbi Yossi HaGalili. The Amar Kachem Kalim Mammon Bailim, because Rabbi Yossi HaGalili happens to say that Kachem Kalim is considered to be Mammon Bailim. Again, that belongs to the owners, and therefore if it's Mammon Bailim, it's destroyed just like any other animals in the city. And Rashi explains, Ve'aliva de Rabbi Yossi HaGalili, the Amar, it's like Rabbi Yossi HaGalili who says, Be'parakama de Baba Kama, he says in the first parak of Baba Kama, Umala mal ba'Hashem l'rabos kachem kalim, that comes to exclude kachem kalim. Kachem kalim would be something like a carbon shlomim, not like an ola and an asham. So by kachem kalim, shehem mamono, that's considered his money, it's considered the owner's money. V'hoel mamono him, since it's his money, asurim bahano, it's going to be asur bahano. The afilu demeyan behemtam mikru, even their value is called behemtam, and so again, that's the approach of Reish Lakish. It's Mammon Bailim. That's why it is destroyed. And according to this approach, Aval Kadshe Kachim, but when it comes to Kadshe Kachim, which is not considered to be Mammon Bailim, and the Bach takes out the word Amai, so again, by Kadshe Kachim, that actually would be a good solution. Then we would let it graze until it develops a mum. The Havadai Heim Atzmam Einam Kravim. Now, certainly the Kadshe Kachim, the animals themselves are not going to be brought on the Mizbeach, the Zevach Roshaim Toeva, because the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. Elo Yiru Achi Yastavu, but we will say that they will graze till they develop a mum by Kadshe Kachim. V'yimachron, they'll be sold. V'yiplu Demeim L'nadava, and then the money will fall as a donation. But the Gemara continues, according to this approach, Aval Kadshe Kachim Mai, but again, by Kadshe Kachim, what are you then saying according to this approach of Reish Lakish? You're saying Yiftu, you're going to say by Kadshe Kachim it actually will be redeemed, as Rashi just noted. But if that's the case, Adatani Seifa, instead of saying at the end, instead of the Brisa going on to say that Kadshe Bedek Habayis Yiftu, that Kadshe Bedek Habayis, again, that stuff that was donated for the repair of the Beis HaMikdash, that is redeemed, why do you have to move to Kadshe Bedek Habayis? Liflog Velisni B'didah, the Brisa should have made distinction within Kadshe Mizbeach, according to this approach. And the Brisa should have said, when is this true that we say Yamusu, that's by Kadshem Kalim? Aval Kadshe Kachim Yiftu, but when it comes to Kadshe Kachim, that should be redeemed. And the Gemara answers to that, there is an exception, that's why we don't say that. You could have a situation of a carbon chatos where the owner died, Dilamisa Azla, that in that situation actually, it would be Kadshe Kachim that would end up being left to die, so therefore lo psikole, so therefore it's not true across the board, and that's why the Brisa does not say that. And Rashi explains, if so, when it says that the Brisa goes on, it says, the Kamaflik ben Kadshe Mizbeach leKadshe Bedek Habayis. The Brisa makes that distinction between Kadshe Mizbeach and Kadshe Bedek Habayis. So Liflog Velisni B'didah, we should just make the distinction within Kadshe Mizbeach. But Kadshe Mizbeach Atzman ben Kadshem Kalim leKadshe Kachim. We should make a difference between karbonos that are Kadshem Kalim and karbonos that are Kadshe Kachim. And the Gemara says, Delamisa Azla, when it comes to the carbon chatos shemesu ba'aleh, that actually does die. Kidamrin and chomesh chatos mesos, like we say in Tmura, there are 5 types of carbon chatos that die. So therefore, lo psikole, therefore it's not true across the board. Lemisni, to say that kadshe kachim dirani dachas yiru, to say that kadshe kachim and dirani dachas will graze, because again there are some exceptions by chatos. The kevan demesu lahem osam rishon, because since the wicked owners, since they died, iika chatos shefrishu b'chayim, if there were carbon chatoses that they separated while they were alive, azli lamisa, those would have to die. Because all carbon chatoses that the owners die, those animals do die. But Meseches Horios, that's a Meseches Horios, Mefarish time, when Meseches Horios, it explains the reason. Aval shar kadshe kachim, but in other situations of kadshe kachim, could go nashamos shemesu baleim, for example, a carbon asham, where the owners died yiru, so there, they actually would graze, but again, we don't make that distinction, because it's not true across the board. And the Gemara continues, B'shlama Rabbi Yochanan Lomer Reish Lakish. We understand why Rabbi Yochanan doesn't take Reish Lakish's approach. Tichsev Zevach Roshaim Toeva. He brings a pasuk. It's written that the sacrifice of the wicked is an abomination. That's Rabbi Yochanan's source. El Reish Lakish, my time Lomer Rabbi Yochanan. Why doesn't Reish Lakish say like Rabbi Yochanan? And the Gemara says, Amar Lach, Reish Lakish will say to you, Ki Amrinan Zevach Roshaim Toeva. When do we apply the pasuk of Zevach Roshaim Toeva? Hani Mili Hecha De Isnu Beinayu. That's when the animal is in front of us. Aval Hacha, but over here, Kevan De Ishtini, since there was a change, that is considered to be a change, and we would not apply that pasuk. And Rashi explains, the isnu be'einayu, that's when it's in front of us, dehein atzman, meaning those animals themselves, vaday einon craven, they certainly are not brought on the mizbeach, mishum zevach risham toeva, that's because zevach risham toeva. Aval hachabit over here, di'ikol amemer, where it's possible to say, yiru, that we could let it graze and develop a mum, v'yivalu d'meim l'nadav, and then the money that we get from selling, that can fall, that can be used as a donation, kevan de'ishni, so since that's already a change, leka hacha zevach risham toeva, you no longer have the pasuk, you can't apply the pasuk of zevach risham toeva. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Brisa above said, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Rabbi Shimon says, Behemtecha, it has to be your animal that you destroy in an Ir Hanidachas, v'lo behemas bechor u'maiser. That comes to exclude an animal that is bechor, it's a firstborn animal, or an animal that is maiser, meaning maiser behema. And the Gemara says, B'mayaskina. Now, what exactly is Rabbi Shimon talking about that the word Behemtecha is excluding behemas, bechor, and maiser? Ilema b'tmimin. If we're talking here, if you're going to say that we're talking about a bechor or an animal of maiser behema that is tmimin, meaning to say it has no blemish, so then shlal shamayim, it is true that we don't destroy that animal, but that's not because of the word behemtecha, that's because it's shlal shamayim. It says it has to be shlola, its spoils, the spoils of the city, and this is shlal shamayim, this is something that essentially belongs to heaven, and so it can't be we're talking about tamimin. Again, the halacha is true that by bechor and meiser that are tamimin, they are not destroyed together with everything in the Ar Hanidachas, but it's learned from a different pasuk. So ella, rather bebale mumin, rather you're going to say we're talking about a bechor and meiser that has developed a mum, it's developed a blemish, but then that actually should be destroyed. Shalolaninu, that is the spoils of the city, and therefore that should be destroyed with all of the property in the city. And the Gemara continues and answers, Amar Ravina, Ravina says, Ravina is explaining Rabbi Shimon, Liolam bebale mumin, really we are talking about these animals have blemishes. However, it's still going to be excluded because umi shenechal b'toras behemtecha, it has to be something that is eaten as your animal. Yatzuelu, that comes to exclude these cases, bechor and meiser, she'ein necholin b'toras behemtecha, they're not eaten as your animal, el b'toras bechor u'meiser, rather they're eaten as bechor and meiser, teshlal shamayim ninu, because they are the spoils of heaven. And Rashi explains, "V'lo behemas bechor u'maiser," not the animals of bechor and meiser. Shem hayu ba bechoros u'maiser behema shushal Yisrael. If within the city you have firstborn animals, or you have meiser behema that belongs to Yisrael, v'chelbo v'dam akarv. In those cases, the fat and the blood is brought on the mizbeach. Ein machrimin oso ima. We don't destroy those animals together with all the animals of the city. Delo mikri behemta, because it's not called the animals of the residents of the city. And so the Gemara asked, well, that's excluded from a different pasuk. Shlal shamayim, that's the spoils of heaven. Umishalola nafka should actually be learned out from shlola. And so the Gemara says, Ela b'balei mumim, rather what Rav Shimon is talking about is they have a blemish, she'ein b'hem chelik l'gavoa, that no portion of them is going to go to heaven on the mizbeach. Ela ne'cholon l'baylam, it's all going to be eaten by the owners. So shlola ninu, so then that should be considered the spoils of the city, because it's eaten by the owners. Amayin machrim and osani moin. So why don't we destroy them together with everything in the city? And the Gemara then answered, according to Ravina, Liolam b'balei mumin, really we are talking where they have a blemish. Va'afilu hachi ein nisraf, and ima, nevertheless they are not destroyed together with everything in the city. The darshina l'krahachi, because we darshan as follows: behemta, the animals again of the residents of the city. Lamisha nechal lebailim b'toras behemtam. It has to be something eaten by the owner as their animal. Yatsu elu, to exclude these cases. Sheyesh lem shem lavoy. There's another name that accompanies them. She'ein nechalim b'toras behemtam. They're not eaten because they're the animals of the owner. She'ein omrin behemas ir hanidachas. We don't say that's the animal, the ir hanidachas. Ela behemas b'chor u'maiser. Rather, it's the animals which are bechors and meiser, shel ir hanidachas, of an ir hanidachas. And so that's the reason why it's excluded, and that's also the reason again why it's excluded from the word behemta. And the Gemara continues, Upliga de Shmuel, and Ravina's approach and Rabbi Shimon, that argues with Shmuel's approach within Rabbi Shimon. Diyamar Shmuel, because Shmuel says, Hakol karev v'hakol nifta, everything is brought and everything is redeemed. And the Gemara immediately asks, my Kamar, well, what exactly is Shmuel saying? What does he mean by everything is brought and everything is redeemed? And the Gemara continues and explains, Hachi Kamar, this is what Shmuel is saying. Kol shekarev kishutam v'nifta kishu ba'almum, anything that is brought as a carbon when there's no blemish, and redeemed when there is a blemish, mishlal imot, that's excluded excluded from the word shlal, from spoils, and it's not destroyed with everything, along with everything in the Yarni Dachas. V'chol shekarev kashutam ve'eno nifta. Now anything which is brought when there's no blemish, ve'eno nifta kashu balmum, but it's not redeemed when there is a blemish, kigon bechor u'maiser. For example, bechor and maiser, mi behema nafka. That's not learned out from shlal, but rather that is learned out from behema. And Rashi explains, upliga had Ravina ad Shmuel. What Ravina, his explanation of Rabbi Shimon, it argues on Shmuel. Diyamar Shmuel Allah dehamil said Rabbi Shimon, because Shmuel, he answered that question with regards to Rabbi Shimon, ki avakasha lon b'may askinan, because again, the question on Rabbi Shimon is, what is he talking about when he says, he talks about Bechor and Meiser? If he's talking about when there's no blemish, it's learned from Shlola. And if he's talking when there is a blemish, so then it really does belong to the owner, it should be destroyed. So he gave a different answer than Ravina. He answered by saying everything is brought and everything is redeemed. My kamar, what does he mean to say? Hachi kamar, this is what he's saying. Kol shu karev legavoa, anything that's brought to the Almighty, meaning anything that's brought on the mizbeach keshutam when it has no blemish. Ucheshu ba'al mum tzarich b'di, and if it does have a blemish, it needs redemption. What are those? Kagon, for example, shar kachim kalim chutz mimaiser behema bechor. Basically, all kachim kalim, with the exception of maiser behema and bechor. So hanu mishlola nafka. All of those cases are learned from shlola. Dein machrimen osam ima. It's all learned from shlola that you don't destroy those animals together with everything in the city. Tehoel utzrichi pedia. The logic is as follows: since those are items which need to be redeemed, b'muman, when they have a blemish, shlal shamayim karina bay. The very fact that it needs redemption shows it belongs to heaven. It's shlal shamayim, and it's excluded from shlola. And Rashi points out, Upali goled the Tanakama. According to this, again, Rabbi Shimon is arguing on the Tanakama, Diyamar Kachim Kalim Maman Bailim, because we said above, according to the Tanakama, Kachim Kalim is Maman Bailim, and it is destroyed with the other things that are destroyed in the city. And Rabbi Shimon is saying that's not the case. Rabbi Shimon is saying it's considered Shalal Shamayim, because it's something that's offered on the Mizbeach, and even when it has a mum, it is something that needs to be redeemed. That's how Shmuel understands, again, within Rabbi Shimon, in terms of other Kachim Kalim. V'chol shekarev kashutam ve'eno nifta kashu balmum. Now, anything that is brought on the mizbeach when it is a tam, but it doesn't get redeemed when it's a balmum, elanechol abailam, it's just eaten by the owners when it has a blemish. Kagon bechor and meiser, that would be bechor and meiser. Hahu lav shlal shamayim mikru. Those are not called shlal shamayim. Ve'afilu b'tamusan, even when there's no mum, even when there is no blemish, but fundamentally it's not called shlal shamayim because automatically with a mum it goes to the owner. That's not called shlal shamayim. So that needs to be excluded from some other pasuk. It cannot be excluded from shlala. You can't ask that if it has no blemish, isn't that shlal shamayim? That was the original question that started the whole discussion. No, you don't ask that at all. Because once we know it's eaten with a blemish, it means it's not really fundamentally shlal shamayim. And therefore, that's the reason itzrich behemta lemeute. That's why we need the word behemta to exclude bechor umaiser tamimim. Even in a situation of bechor and meiser that have no blemish, you need that word behemta for the exclusion, the mishlala lekal mutinu, because you cannot exclude that from the word shlala. V'hainu plig, and that's why Shmuel's approach is arguing with Ravina's approach. The iu muki lo afilo betmim, because the point is that according to Shmuel's approach, the pasuk of behemta, that exclusion, it also applies to tamimim by bechor and meiser. The kasavar bechor and meiser balei mumin behemta karina be uvesayif. Because again, when it comes to bechor and meiser balei mumin, that is called behemta, and that would be besayif. And Rashi's adding there at the end that specifically it's by tamimim. That's actually exactly what is being excluded by Rabbi Shimon. By Bechor and Meiser, we're excluding it because we're saying that it's not considered to be behemta in that situation. And according to Shmuel's approach, actually in a situation where it does have a mum, it actually is called behemta. It's actually not excluded and actually would be destroyed together with all the other animals in the city. Again, according to Shmuel's approach within Rabbi Shimon, there would be sayif in that situation. So there's actually a practical, it's not just a drasha disagreement, but there's a practical disagreement. According to Ravina, the word behemta in the pasuk is specifically excluding bechor and meiser that have a mum. That's being excluded again from behemta, and it's not going to be destroyed because there's that shem lavoy. It's not really considered the animal of the owner, but it's considered the animal of bechor of meiser of the owner. But according to Shmuel's approach, no, the word behemta is excluding when it's a bechor or meiser that is tamimim, that they do not have a mum. That's not considered to be behemta. It's excluded from behemta because since when it has a mum, it's eaten by the owner. So therefore, in that situation, it's not excluded from shalola. It's not considered shlal shamayim, but it is excluded from behemta. It's considered to be excluded because, again, it is a situation where it's brought on the mizbeach. However, in a situation of bechor and meiser where it has a mum, that actually is considered to be behemta. It's not excluded at all, and therefore it would be destroyed. According to Shmuel's approach, it would be destroyed along with the other animals in the city. And the Gemara continues at the two dots. The Mishnah said, Trumos Yirkavu, if you have Truma in the Yer Hanidachas, then that should be left to rat. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda says, Lo Shanu Ela Truma Biyad Yisrael. What we're talking about in the Mishnah is if the Truma is in the possession of a Yisrael. Aval Truma Biyad Kohen, but if the Truma is in the possession of a Kohen, Kevan Demimone, who since it is his money, since it belongs to him, so Tisarif, so it's like anybody else's property, and it is burned, it's destroyed like everything else that's in that city. And Rashi explains, Truma biyad Yisrael, we're talking specifically about Truma in the hands of a Yisrael, Sha'adayin lo nitno l'kohen, meaning it still wasn't given to a Kohen. Diafilu also Yisrael rashu, that even if that Yisrael is a Rasha, he's wicked, Truma shabiyado ein nisrefes, you're not going to burn the Truma in his possession, imshar shlala, with the rest of the spoils, to halav dideyu, because that doesn't really belong to him, the shema hayin nitno l'kohen sadik, because maybe it would have been given to a Kohen who's righteous, shabachutzala, who's outside of the city. Hilkach ein nisrefes, therefore, it is not burned, the haino Pikado and the Iracheres, it's as if there's a deposit from another city, Visnu Begava, that happens to be in the city. The Amar Leal, we said earlier, the Mutar, and that's Mutter. Now, granted, he can't eat it, the Shema Hayanitlo Lakohen Rasha, because maybe it would be given to a Kohen who's wicked, Shebesocha, who's in the city, Hilkach Yirkavu. Therefore, in this situation, again, it is left to rat. Aval Truma Biad Kohen, but if it's Truma in the possession of the Kohen, the Memonehu, which it is his property, so then Tisaref, then it is burned. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asks a question on this from the Mishnah. It said, Meiser Sheni v'kisvei hakodesh yigonzu. It said that Meiser Sheni, and if you have holy writings, then those are buried. And so the Gemara asks, Meiser Sheni biyad Yisrael, but Meiser Sheni, in the possession of a Yisrael, Ketruma biyad Kohen dami, that's actually similar to Truma in the possession of a Kohen. The Yisrael is allowed to have that Meiser Sheni, to eat that Meiser Sheni. V'katani yigonzu, but yet it still says, even though it's just like Truma biyad Kohen, it still says yigonzu, it says that it's buried, unlike the situation of Truma biyad Kohen, which Rav Chisda said above is burned. And Rashi explains, V'katani yigonzu, and again it says that it is interred, it's buried, Afagav de Memonehu, even though it is his property, Lo Amarti, sorry if it doesn't say that it's burned in that case. And so the Gemara continues and revises Rav Chisda's statement, Eli itmar hachi itmar. Rather, if something was stated, this is actually what was stated. Amar Rav Chisda says, Lo shanu ela truma biyad Kohen. The Mishnah is specifically talking about truma in the hands of the Kohen. Avol truma biyad Yisrael, but if the truma is in the hands of the Yisrael, then tinosin leKohen shabir acheres. It should simply be given to a Kohen in another city. And Rashi explains, Ela truma biyad Kohen. The Mishnah is specifically about truma in the hands of the Kohen, that again, it's not burned, it's not destroyed. Rather, we're going to say it's left to rat. Why is that? The memonehu, because it really does belong to the Kohen. Technically speaking, it should be destroyed. Below mizalzalin on bak kulihai, but we're not going to be mizalzalin it so much. We don't want to degrade the truma hoel v'kodesh, since at the end of the day it is holy. But if it belongs to a Yisrael, so then there's a simple solution. L'kohen shabir acheres, just give it to a Kohen in another city. Kilomar l'kohen shalohu dachimoin, meaning to a Kohen who was not subverted, who didn't worship avodah zarah, together with them. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasam, we learned in a Mishnah over there, and the Mesorah Sashah says this is not a Mishnah but a Brisa. Isa shal Meiser Sheni, if you have dough of Meiser Sheni, Petura min achala, it's exempt from chala. Divrei Rabbi Meir, these are the words of Rabbi Meir. V'chachamim mechayven, and the Chachamim say it's obligated in chala. And the Gemara says, Amar Rav Chisda says, Machlokes b'Meiser Sheni b'Yerushalayim. The whole Machlokes Tanoim over here is when the Meiser Sheni is in Yerushalayim. The Rabbi Meir savar Meiser Sheni mamon gavoa, who Rabbi Meir holds the Meiser Sheni belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, belongs to Shamayim, and that's why it's exempt from chala. V'Rabbanan savri, but the Rabbanan say mamon hedyot, who it's considered like it belongs to the person, and therefore it's obligated in chala. Avol b'gvulin, but let's say it's found outside of Yerushalayim, divrei hakol pater, then everybody agrees it's exempt from chala. And the Gemara continues, Mesev Rav Yosef. Rav Yosef asks on this, Meiser Sheni v'chisvei hakodesh yigonzu. In our Mishnah again it says that Meiser Sheni and kisvei hakodesh, that they are buried. And so the Gemara says, B'may askinim, well, what exactly is the situation of the Meiser Sheni in our Mishnah? Ilema b'Yerushalayim. If you're going to say that the Meiser Sheni is in Yerushalayim, we're talking about Meiser Sheni is in Yerushalayim, and Yerushalayim is in Ir Hanidachas. That's impossible. We have a Ir Hanidachas. Can Yerushalayim be in Ir Hanidachas? But we learned in the Brisa, Asar Devarim Nemru b'Yerushalayim. There are 10 things that are said with regards to Yerushalayim, and one of them is Eino Nasis Yer Hanidachas. It cannot become an Yer Hanidachas, so that cannot possibly be the case. V'yela bir acheres, rather the case could be that it was Meiser Sheni in another city, v'yaskula gavon, and they brought it into Yerushalayim. But the Gemara says there also hakaltu mechitzos, there it would have been captured, it would be taken in by the mechitzos of Yerushalayim. And so the Gemara says, Elalaf b'gvul, rather the case is that we're talking where the Meiser Sheni is outside of Yerushalayim. V'katani yigonzu, and what does it say over here? It says that it is buried. And the Gemara continues and answers, Lo no, liolam dir acheres, really it is from another city. V'yasku legavo, and they brought the Meiser Sheni into Yerushalayim. V'hacha b'mayaskin, and here the case is shenitma, that it became tameh. And Rashi explains that Rav Chisda said when it comes Aval Begvulin, when it comes to Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, so there she'ein lo heter achila, there where you can't eat the Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim ela b'ptiyah, it has to be redeemed. So divrei hakol, there everybody agrees peturim and achal, it's exempt from chala to mamon gavoa, because over there you're not going to eat that Meiser Sheni, it has to be redeemed. It's considered mamon gavoa. That's why Rav Chisda says in that situation it is certainly exempt from chala. Lishna Achrina, Rashi says another explanation, Aval Begvulin, outside of Yerushalayim, the ein lo heter achila, where there is no heter to eat it b'shas chiyav chala, at the time that it would become obligated in chala. The hainu b'shas gilgol ha'isa, meaning at the time that you're kneading the dough, lo karina bei reishas arisosechem, it's not going to be called reishas arisosechem. Ve'afilu pada le'achar mikano, even if it's going to be redeemed after that, but pater min achala, it's going to be exempt from chala, because again, at that point in time, it's ein lo heter achila, so at that point in time, again, there is no chiyav chala. And Rashi continues, Yud Devarim Nemru B'Yerushalayim. There are 10 things that are said by Yerushalayim, Perek Meruba Chashavlu. These are mentioned in Bava Kama, Perek Meruba. And so the Gemara then says, Ela B'Ir Acheres V'Asku L'Gava. So you'll say, maybe our Mishnah is talking where it was in another city. Again, meaning to say the Meiser Sheni was from another city that was in Ir Hanidachas, and it was brought to Yerushalayim. Shayosa Meiser Sheni Shalechon Mibnei Ir Hanidachas. That Meiser Sheni belonged to someone who was a resident of the Ir Hanidachas. V'Helu Oso Yerushalayim, and they brought the Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim before the city was subverted. And then they were subverted. So then Imkaina Ma Yignazu. But if that's the case, so why are we storing this Meiser Sheni? Lishtru Nami Bachila. On the contrary, you should be able to eat this Meiser Sheni. Because now the walls of Yerushalayim, the Hainu Choma, the wall of Yerushalayim, has now taken it in, and so to speak, it's part of Yerushalayim now. You should be able to eat it. And so then the Gemara said, Elalav Bigvul, and rather the case is that it is outside of Yerushalayim, Velo Matule, V'Katani Yignazu, and it hasn't reached Yerushalayim, and it says that you should bury it. Ve'eno Yotze Lisar, if it's not taken out to be burned, Bitmia, why shouldn't it be burned? V'Yamisa Devigvulin L'Divrei Hakol Momen Gavoa. Now, if it's true that in Gavulin, that when you have Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim, everybody agrees it's Momen Gavoa, so Lishtri Nami Ba'achila, so then you should actually even be allowed to eat it. Elalav Momen Hedyeru, rather don't we see from our Mishnah that Meiser Sheni outside of Yerushalayim is going to be considered Mammon Hedyer, it belongs to the person. Unahid of Israel alone. Now you could say, granted, we don't want to burn it, Mishum Zilusa, because again, that's already degrading to the Meiser Sheni, and so therefore we say Yignazu, therefore we say that we should bury it, but it certainly does not seem to be Mammon Gavoa, because again, then it should even be allowed to be eaten. It seems to be that it's Mammon Hedyer. That's the question from our Mishnah on Rav Chisda. And Rashi continues, Liolam dir hanidachas. Really, our Mishnah is talking about Meiser Sheni of an ir hanidachas. V'yaske lagavan. It was brought into Yerushalayim. U'dekoamrit lishtru nami ba'achila. And that you're asking, it should be permitted ba'achila. We should be allowed to eat it because it's in Yerushalayim. Da kaltum mechitzos. It's within the walls of Yerushalayim. So hachav am I asking on kishanitma? Here the case is it's tamei. The lav barachule betumo, because you can't eat it when it's tamei. Dechsiv lo biyartim mimenu betamei, as it says in the pasuk. U'lekamon parach. And the Gemara later on is going to ask, my ir hanidachas. If we're talking where it's tamei, and that's why you can't eat it, so what do we even need to consider that it's an ir hanidachas, afilu bechutzala, even if it's from some other city, the same halacha would be true. But the Gemara continues, how can you say we're talking about Meiser Sheni that is tamei? Because there's also a solution. V'lifrikei, the solution should be that you should simply redeem that Meiser Sheni. The Omer Rebbe Lazar, because Rebbe Lazar says, Minayin l'Meiser Sheni shenitma shepodino so afilu b'Yerushalayim. From where do we know that Meiser Sheni that becomes tamei, you're allowed to redeem it even in Yerushalayim? Talmud lomer lo suchal se'eso. The pasuk says you're not able to carry it all. That's talking about the general redemption of Meiser Sheni onto money. But ve'ein se'es ela achila. But we darshan that se'es could even refer to any situation where you cannot eat it, like where it's tamei, you're allowed to redeem in that case as well. Shenemar v'yisa masos meis panav. It says v'yisa masos meis panav, which is talking about eating, it's talking about food. And so again, there does seem to be a solution. Rashi explains, v'afilu b'Yerushalayim, even in Yerushalayim, la'achar shenichnas, even it entered Yerushalayim, you can redeem it. V'yafagav the darshinan ki yirchak mimcha hamokom etzarto akesef v'yodcha b'richuk mokom atapoda v'tzar v'lo b'kirav mokom. Even though we darshan that you have to be far away from Yerushalayim to redeem, not close by, buy, but we make a drasha vein seis ela achila. Seis is referring to eating. As long as you can't eat it, you're allowed to redeem it. If it's far away, or any situation where you can't eat it, shenitma, that it became tamei, then v'tzarta kesef biyadcha, then again you're allowed to redeem it onto money. And the Gemara continues and answers, and here what are we talking about? B'lakuach, we're talking where it was food that was purchased with the money of Meiser Sheni. Rashi explains, B'lakuach shekvar hotzia b'hotzala kesef Meiser, you already redeemed it onto Meiser, unisanu b'yayin v'sheicher uvasar, and then you took the money, you spent it, you bought wine, you bought beer, you bought meat, v'nitma osalakuach, and then what was purchased became tamei, dahu lesle pediyah, because that's actually not allowed to be redeemed. V'chi kamer Rebbe Lazar, and when did Rebbe Lazar say that it could be redeemed Meiser Sheni Gufe? That's talking about actual Meiser Sheni, not the stuff that was bought with the money of Meiser Sheni, but the original Meiser Sheni. Shehel Peiros Meiser Sheni l'Yerushalayim, and it's talking when you brought Peiros of Meiser Sheni to Yerushalayim and they became Tamei. That's when Rebbe Lazar says that you can redeem it, but it would not be true by Lakuach, it would not be true by that which is bought, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph.